The summer of 2003 was one of those blistering, humid seasons that seemed to stretch endlessly across the Midwest, baking everything beneath a relentless sun and heavy air. In the small town of Eldridge, Iowa, the days were filled with the drone of cicadas and the smell of freshly cut hay. At night, the heat didn't ease much. It just settled in like a thick blanket, making sleep restless and dreams uneasy. I was 18 and home for the summer, working at the local hardware store. The store was a tiny place on Main Street, and my shifts usually ended around 10 p.m., leaving me with a couple of hours before midnight to kill. That particular Saturday night was hotter than most, the kind of heat that made the pavement shimmer and the air buzz. My best friend Jason and I had plans to meet up after my shift to hang out at his family's farm just outside of town. Jason's farm was the usual spot for summer nights, a place to drink beer, sit by the fire pit, and forget the slow, predictable rhythm of small-town life. I got off work around 10:05, wiped the sweat off my brow, and headed to Jason's truck parked across the street. When I got there, Jason was already leaning against the hood, the glow of a cigarette briefly illuminating his face. His eyes were tired but lively, the kind of tired that came from a day spent in the sun and the anticipation of a long, wild night. "Ready?" he asked, flicking ash onto the cracked pavement. "Yeah, man. Let's get out of here," I said. We jumped into his old Ford F-150 and rumbled out of town, tires kicking up dust along the gravel road that led to his farm. The sky was a deep purple, stars beginning to pierce the thick curtain of clouds. We rolled the windows down, letting the warm air rush in, carrying with it the scent of corn and grass. Jason's farm was everything I loved about summer nights. The vast openness, the chorus of frogs and crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. His parents were away visiting relatives, so we had the place to ourselves. We set up around the fire pit near the barn, cracked open a couple of beers, and let the quiet settle around us. As the fire popped and sparks floated up into the dark, Jason started telling stories, ghost stories, mostly, about the old farm and the nearby woods. He mentioned a legend about a man who had disappeared there decades ago, a local named Carl Everett. They said he'd gone mad, wandering the woods for days before vanishing without a trace. Some said his spirit still roamed the area, looking for something or someone. I laughed it off, but Jason's voice dropped to a whisper, and the firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to creep closer. "Ever feel like you're being watched out here?" Jason asked. I nodded, feeling a chill despite the heat. We sat there for a while, the stories fading into the crackle of the fire and the steady pulse of the night. Then Jason suggested we take a walk down to the edge of the woods, just a short distance from the barn. It was a stupid idea, but part of me wanted to see if any of the stories were true. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped into the darkness, the beam cutting through the thick underbrush. The woods smelled damp and earthy, the trees standing tall and silent. Every step we took seemed to echo, swallowed quickly by the vast stillness. About 10 minutes in, we heard something, a soft rustling like leaves being dragged across the ground. Jason stopped, holding up his hand. We listened, but the sound faded as quickly as it came. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, trying to sound casual. We kept walking, deeper into the woods now, the beam of our flashlights bouncing nervously over gnarled roots and broken branches. The stories Jason told echoed in my mind, the man lost, the spirit wandering, the madness. Suddenly the beam caught something in the distance, a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless between two trees. My breath caught in my throat. Jason froze too. The figure didn't move. It looked like a man, but the way it stood was unnatural, too stiff, almost like a mannequin. The shadows obscured the face, but I felt its eyes on us, cold and unblinking. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Jason nodded, but said nothing. We turned to head back, but the path seemed different, narrower, darker. The trees pressed closer, and the beam of the flashlight wavered. Then the figure was gone. "Let's get out of here," Jason said, his voice low. We quickened our pace, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly. The rustling came back, closer, louder. Something was following us. A whisper floated on the wind, a soft voice calling a name I didn't recognize. Panic seized me. I broke into a run, Jason right behind me. The trees blurred as we pushed through the undergrowth, the whispering growing urgent. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died. We were plunged into darkness. The whisper turned into a low growl, the air thick with something rotten. Then a hand grabbed my arm, cold, clammy, desperate. I screamed and pulled away, tripping over a root and falling hard. Jason yanked me up, and we ran blindly until we burst out of the woods into the moonlit field. We didn't stop until we reached the barn, panting and shaking. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers haunted me, and I kept seeing the pale figure's eyes glowing in the darkness. The next day, the local sheriff told us they had found old Carl Everett's belongings deep in the woods, not far from where we saw the figure. No body, just his journal and some torn clothes. We never went back into those woods after that night. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the cicadas sing, I swear I can still hear the whispers calling my name. The summer of 2014 was one of those sticky, slow ones in rural Kentucky, where the nights are thick with humidity and the cicadas drown out everything else. I was 17, just about to head off to college, and trying to squeeze every last bit of freedom out of the last months of summer before reality set back in. That year, my friend group decided to spend more nights out in the woods, away from parents and phone signals, just hanging around campfires, telling stories, and feeling like nothing bad could ever touch us. One night in late July, four of us, me, my best friend Tyler, his girlfriend Jess, and my cousin Mike, planned to camp out at an old spot in the forest about an hour's drive from our town. The place was a clearing near the remnants of an abandoned homestead, a few cracked foundations, and some twisted old trees that locals said were cursed. No one had lived there for decades, and rumors about strange happenings had circulated forever, but we never took them seriously. They were just stories. We packed up Tyler's truck with tents, sleeping bags, food, and a few beers, and left around 8 in the evening, the sun still hanging low but fading fast. The drive was quiet, except for the usual jokes and music on the radio. We parked near the edge of the clearing and started setting up camp while the last light faded. After the fire was going and the stars were out, the forest felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. The air was warm but heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. We passed around drinks, laughed, and told ghost stories, mostly about the old homestead and the people who supposedly vanished there years ago. I noticed Jess seemed quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight. Around midnight, Tyler suggested we explore the ruins. He wanted to check out the cellar hatch, which had been partially buried and sealed off. Mike and I weren't thrilled but followed anyway, our flashlights cutting through the dark. As we walked closer, the air grew noticeably colder. Even Jess, who had stayed by the fire, stood and followed us with a nervous glance. When we reached the cellar hatch, a rotting wooden door set into the ground, we all hesitated. The stories said people heard whispers from beneath, sometimes saw flickering lights inside. We shone our flashlights down into the opening, but saw nothing but darkness. Mike tried to pry the hatch open with a sturdy branch, and after a few minutes, it gave way with a groan, revealing a set of old, crumbling stone steps descending into pitch black. "Let's not," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Tyler flashed a grin. "Come on, don't be a scaredy cat." Against better judgment, we decided to take turns climbing down. Mike went first, flashlight in hand. He disappeared into the blackness, his light bobbing lower and lower. After a moment, he called out, "It's just a cellar. Old crates and bottles." Then, silence. A minute later, Mike's voice changed, almost like he was struggling to speak. "Guys, I think I hear something." We leaned closer to the opening, trying to hear. A faint whisper floated up from below, unintelligible but definitely there. Suddenly, the light from Mike's flashlight flickered and went out. "Mike?" Tyler shouted. No answer. Jess grabbed Tyler's arm, eyes wide. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, a low moan came from the darkness beneath us, a sound like a breath but colder than ice. It rose, growing louder and desperate, echoing off the stone walls. Then the cellar hatch slammed shut with a violent bang. We stumbled back, hearts pounding, scrambling to open it again, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew oppressive, like something was pressing down on us from all sides. Jess started crying, begging us to leave. Tyler tried kicking the hatch, but stopped suddenly, his face draining of color. Behind us, from the tree line, a figure stepped forward. Tall and pale, its features indistinct, but eyes glowing faintly. It didn't walk, it glided. We froze. The creature opened its mouth, emitting that same chilling moan. Mike's voice called out faintly from beneath the hatch. "Help me." The sound cut off abruptly. Then silence. We didn't wait another second. We ran back to the truck, tires spinning on loose gravel as we tore away from the clearing. The radio crackled strangely on the way home, snippets of voices and static filling the air. No one spoke much after that night. Mike didn't show up for school the next day. We heard later he disappeared without a trace, his parents baffled. Jess moved away. Tyler and I stopped talking about what we saw. But some nights when the air is thick and the wind still, I swear I can hear that moan, faint and desperate, calling from the dark. And I wonder if Mike is still down there, waiting. Story, the end. The summer night was unusually warm for early July in central Indiana. The kind of heat that settled into your skin and made every breath heavy and thick. I was 23, freshly graduated from college, home for the summer before I had to move to Chicago for a new job. It was one of those slow, humid nights where nothing much seems to happen, but the kind of evenings you don't forget. I was with two friends from back home, Ben and Emily. Ben was the kind of guy who loved those old local legends and ghost stories. Emily was skeptical, but loved the thrill. We'd spent the day at the lake with some other friends, swimming and laughing, and now it was getting late, around 11 p.m., but the heat made it hard to sleep. Ben suggested we drive out to a spot just outside town, a stretch of old railroad tracks surrounded by thick woods, a place kids sometimes went to skip rocks in the nearby creek or explore when they were bored. The road to the tracks was narrow, lined with towering sycamores and maples, the shadows long and dense, even under a bright moon. We rolled down the windows of Ben's pickup to let in the heavy night air, the scent of grass, wet earth, and wood smoke hanging faintly. When we arrived, the place was quiet except for the distant hoot of an owl. The tracks stretched into darkness both directions, rusty and unused for years. The creek ran just alongside, its water shallow and murmuring softly over smooth stones. The three of us climbed down the embankment to the water's edge and sat on large boulders, throwing pebbles and watching the ripples spread. Ben started telling one of his favorite local stories about a railroad worker who disappeared mysteriously one summer night decades ago. Legend said his spirit still walked the tracks, searching for his lost life. Emily rolled her eyes but listened anyway. As the story went on, the air around us seemed to chill, though the night was still heavy with warmth. The creek's babbling slowed to an eerie hush, and the distant woods grew quiet, the usual night sounds dying out like someone had flipped a switch. Then, without warning, the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush came from the woods behind us. A slow, deliberate crunching of dry leaves and twigs underfoot, coming closer. I froze, heart hammering. Ben shone his flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only caught shifting shadows. The noise stopped suddenly, and an oppressive silence returned. Then Emily whispered, "Did you see that?" and pointed toward the far end of the creek where the water gleamed oddly in the moonlight. We all looked, and there it was. A pale figure standing just past the water, motionless, almost blending with the silver light. It didn't move, didn't blink or breathe visibly, just stared at us with hollow eyes. Ben tried to laugh it off, saying it must be some kid playing a prank. But the figure didn't shift or respond. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head and began to slowly walk toward us, not quite human, its movements jerky and unnatural. We scrambled back up the embankment, Ben's flashlight catching glimpses of its ragged clothes, water dripping from its limbs. The figure was closer now, stepping into the clearing near the truck. Emily was trembling, and I could barely breathe. Ben jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it tight. We didn't wait. The engine roared to life, tires spinning on the gravel as Ben peeled away from the tracks, the figure standing frozen in the moonlight as we sped down the road. For days afterward, none of us spoke about what we saw. But sometimes at night, I swear I hear that slow crunching of leaves outside my window or glimpse a pale shadow just beyond the street lamp's glow. That summer night by the railroad tracks changed everything. I don't know what it was we saw, but some things are better left in the dark. Story, the end. The summer night started like any other back in '03 when I was 22 and living in a small town just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. It was the kind of night that clings to your skin. humid and thick, the air humming with the sounds of crickets and distant traffic. Me and my two closest friends, Josh and Emily, had been planning to escape the monotony of our day jobs and the constant buzz of the city by heading out to the countryside, an old patch of woods and farmland known locally as Mill Creek Preserve. It was a place most folks avoided after dark, but we figured the isolation was exactly what we needed. Josh drove his beat-up pickup truck, the one he inherited from his dad. The truck rattled, growled, and coughed, but it was reliable enough to get us through the gravel roads leading out of town. Emily rode shotgun, already half asleep from her long shift at the diner, and I was in the back seat, my knees pressed against the door, staring out at the fading orange sky. We arrived at the preserve just as the sun was dipping behind the tree line. The woods swallowed the last bits of daylight fast, and a quiet settled around us that felt almost unnatural. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the faint buzz of insects. We unloaded our gear, 2 sleeping bags, some snacks, a bottle of whiskey Josh had snagged from his uncle, and a lantern, and started hiking down the narrow trail that wound deeper into the preserve. The path was uneven and littered with roots, and the thick canopy overhead blocked out much of the moonlight, leaving us stumbling sometimes in the near darkness. After about 20 minutes, we reached a clearing where a small creek meandered lazily through the grass. It was perfect. The kind of quiet place you expect to find on postcards, peaceful, isolated, untouched. We spread out our sleeping bags near the creek's edge and lit the lantern, casting warm golden light over the grass and wildflowers. Josh cracked open the whiskey and poured a couple of cups. We settled in, talking quietly at first, reminiscing about college, relationships, and plans for the future. But as the night wore on and the bottle emptied, the stories got quieter, more personal. Emily told us about a time when she was a kid and got lost in the woods near her grandmother's farm. She described how the trees seemed to close in on her, how the shadows shifted and danced, and how she swore she heard someone, or something, whispering her name. Josh and I listened, eyes fixed on the flickering light, trying not to let the story send chills down our spines. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just a faint rustling from somewhere beyond the creek, a branch snapping, maybe an animal moving through the brush. We joked about it, trying to laugh it off. But then the sounds got closer, soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching dry leaves and twigs just beyond the edge of the clearing. I remember looking at Josh, whose jaw had tightened, eyes narrowing toward the darkness. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip ice cold. The lantern flickered, sputtering for a moment before steadying. "Probably just a deer," Josh said, voice tight. "Don't worry about it." But none of us believed him. The footsteps circled us, moving slowly around the clearing, never breaking into a run, never rushing, just pacing. A steady, measured rhythm that echoed in the night. Then came the whispers. They were faint, almost indistinguishable at first, like the wind carrying voices from far away. But as the seconds ticked by, they grew louder, more urgent. We couldn't make out the words, but they had a strange cadence, like chanting or prayer. I felt my skin crawl. The hairs on my arms stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Emily whispered, "Did you hear that?" Josh shook his head, the bravado slipping away. "Maybe we should pack up." Before any of us could move, the lantern went out. The sudden blackness was suffocating. We fumbled with matches and lighter, but the damp air made it hard to keep the flame alive. Panic rose in my chest like a living thing. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of what little moonlight filtered through the trees, a figure stood motionless. Tall, thin, covered in ragged, dirty clothes that blended into the shadows. No face, just darkness. The whispers crescendoed into a low hum, vibrating through the air. The figure raised an arm, pointing a crooked finger at us. I swear I could hear the breath leaving Josh's lungs as he whispered, "Run." We didn't hesitate. We scrambled to our feet and sprinted back down the trail, branches slapping at our faces and bodies. The whispers chased us, echoing in the trees, surrounding us like a storm. When we burst out onto the gravel road, gasping for air, Josh's truck was just a few yards away. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and sped off, the headlights cutting through the night as we put distance between us and the preserve. For weeks after, none of us could shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing the whispers at night, soft and persistent. Emily refused to go near the woods again. Josh tried to laugh it off, but I caught him staring nervously into the dark whenever we drove past the preserve. I've never told anyone else about that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. But sometimes when the summer wind whistles through the trees, I swear I hear that low hum calling my name. Story the end. That summer night started out like so many others in my hometown, a small, nondescript place in rural Ohio where nothing much ever happened. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and kids roam freely until the fireflies come out. I was 20 years old then, home from college for the summer, working at the local hardware store, and hanging out with my friends, mostly just trying to enjoy the last carefree months before the real world set in. My best friend Dave and I had been talking all week about taking a late night drive just to get out of the house and clear our heads. We settled on heading down to the old quarry a few miles out of town. It was a place kids used to swim in during the summer, even though it was technically off limits. Nobody cared much, though. It was secluded, quiet, and perfect for a summer night hangout. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. It wasn't exactly the safest spot, especially at night, but we'd done it a few times before. That night, the sky was clear and full of stars, the heat of the day still clinging to the air like a wet blanket. We grabbed a couple of beers and jumped in Dave's beat-up pickup truck around 10 p.m. The drive out was uneventful at first. We rolled the windows down and blasted some classic rock as the truck rumbled along the cracked pavement of the country roads. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with the night air, and every so often, a barn or a lonely farmhouse would flash by under the orange glow of a flickering street lamp. When we got to the quarry, the air felt cooler, heavier somehow, and the silence was more profound than I remembered from the daytime. We parked near the edge, jumped out, and carried our beers down to the water's edge. The quarry was huge, a deep pit filled with cold, murky water and surrounded by steep rock walls and thick woods. The moonlight shimmered faintly on the surface, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish or frog. We sat there on the rocky shore, talking quietly, letting the night stretch on around us. Dave was telling me about his plans for the fall, how he wanted to transfer schools, maybe move to the city. I was quieter, mostly just watching the water and listening. After a while, Dave got the idea to go swimming. I wasn't really in the mood. I didn't like the cold, and swimming in that dark water always felt weird, but he convinced me to come in just for a bit. We stripped down to our shorts and slipped into the quarry, the water icy against our skin. As we swam, I noticed something odd, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the tree line on the far side of the quarry. At first, I thought it was just the rustling of leaves or the movement of some animal. But it was too steady, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow. I mentioned it to Dave, but he laughed it off, saying it was probably just a deer or raccoon. Still, the noise persisted, growing louder, closer. We climbed out of the water, wrapping ourselves in towels and heading back toward the truck, but the footsteps seemed to be following us. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, heart pounding. When we reached the truck, Dave locked the doors and started the engine. Just as we were about to pull away, I saw them, two figures standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the moonlight. They were motionless, watching us. Their eyes seemed to glow faintly, reflecting the headlights like something unnatural. I couldn't look away, frozen with fear. Dave slammed the gas pedal, and we tore down the road, the engine roaring as we sped away. Behind us, the figures remained, standing perfectly still as if they had been waiting for us all along. For weeks after, I had nightmares of those eyes watching me, of footsteps circling just beyond the trees, of cold water pulling me under. Dave said he never wanted to talk about that night again. And to this day, whenever the summer heat makes the night heavy and still, I swear I can hear those footsteps again, slow and steady, coming closer from the dark. Story the end. That summer night started like so many others in my hometown of Asheville, North Carolina. Warm air heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and pine, cicadas singing their endless chorus as the sun slipped below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple fading into deep indigo, stars just beginning to peek through the humid veil. We were teenagers back then, reckless in the way only kids on the edge of adulthood can be, drawn to the kind of quiet places adults warned us about, but that called to us anyway. My friends and I had spent the day swimming at the river bend, about 3 miles outside town, the usual spot where the water ran cool and clear over smooth stones, shaded by towering sycamores. As the evening wore on, we gathered around a fire pit in the backyard of my friend Matt's parents' house. The fire flickered in the growing dark, casting long shadows that danced across the wooden fence in the wild patch of woods beyond. We cracked beers and told stories, laughing louder than we should have, daring the night to respond. By 10, a thick fog began rolling in from the valley, hugging the ground and curling through the trees like a living thing. The fog was rare this time of year, and it gave the night an unsettling stillness. Matt's dog, a big golden retriever named Rusty, started barking low and growling at the edge of the yard, his fur bristling. "Easy, boy," Matt said, but even he sounded uneasy. We all fell quiet, eyes scanning the mist-shrouded tree line. The only other sound was the crackling fire and the cicadas, but the dog's barking had stopped suddenly, replaced by a sharp, piercing howl from deep in the woods. No one spoke. We just stared. That's when we saw it, a figure, pale and tall, moving silently between the trees. It didn't walk like a person, too slow, too deliberate, and the fog curled around it like smoke, almost hiding its shape, but it was there. Rusty growled again and bolted toward the figure, barking wildly. "Rusty, come back!" Matt shouted, but it was too late. The figure stopped where the dog had reached it, and for a moment the fog parted enough to see its face, or rather, the lack of one. The figure's face was a blank, smooth white, like a porcelain mask with features. Rusty yelped and ran back, teeth bared and fur standing on end. We scrambled, grabbing whatever we could, the fire sputtering out in the damp air. Matt grabbed a flashlight, its beam trembling as he pointed it toward the woods. The figure was gone. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. "Let's get inside," Matt said, but as we turned, the night seemed to close in, the fog thickening, swallowing the light. That's when the whispers began, soft at first, like a breeze through the leaves, but growing louder, more urgent. They weren't words I could understand, just a guttural, pleading sound that filled the air around us. We ran, tripping over roots and rocks, stumbling through the dark as the whispers followed us, chasing us all the way back to the porch. Once inside, we locked the doors and windows, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to seep through the walls, curling around our ears in the suffocating night. That was the summer night I learned some things don't belong in the light and some fears don't fade with dawn. Story the end. That summer night began like so many others in my small town, the kind where the heat wraps around you like a thick, damp blanket, and the steady hum of cicadas fills the air until dawn. I was 19, home for the summer before starting college, and eager to soak up the long, lazy evenings that only July could offer. The night had a peculiar stillness to it, an almost unnatural quiet beneath the usual chorus of insects and distant traffic. I was hanging out with a couple of friends, Mark and Lisa, at the edge of town near an old, forgotten stretch of woods. We'd heard rumors about strange happenings in that area, stories passed down about lights seen between the trees, figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, things that unsettled even the most skeptical locals. We didn't believe any of it, of course. We were just looking for a place to hang out away from the noise of home and the crowded streets downtown. The woods were close, and the summer night air was inviting, if a little thick with humidity. We set up near a small clearing, sitting on an old fallen log, passing around a bottle of cheap whiskey. The moon was a sliver behind thin clouds, casting everything in shadow and making the woods look deeper, darker than usual. As we talked, the night seemed to shift. The usual sounds faded. The cicadas' hum slowed until it was barely audible. The wind that should have stirred the leaves was still. Even the distant barking of dogs stopped. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Then, faintly at first, we heard it, a soft, almost rhythmic tapping coming from deeper in the woods. Tap, 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 like someone or something walking slowly and deliberately. Mark joked about it being some prankster trying to scare us, but the sound didn't match footsteps. It was too slow, too measured, and it moved in a pattern, coming closer. We grew quiet, eyes scanning the dark woods, waiting. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Not walking, but gliding almost silently across the ground. Tall and thin, dressed in old, tattered clothes that looked like they belonged to another century. Its face was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, with eyes that reflected a cold, unblinking light. Lisa gasped and scrambled backward. Mark and I froze. The figure stopped a few feet from us, tilting its head slowly as if studying us. Then it spoke in a voice that was soft but carried an unbearable weight. "You shouldn't be here." We tried to move, but our legs felt rooted. The figure extended a long, skeletal hand, pointing toward the edge of the woods. "Leave before it's too late." We didn't wait. We turned and ran, the pounding of our feet loud in the sudden return of the night's sounds. Cicadas, wind, and distant cars. We never went back to that clearing, and though we tried to tell people what happened, the words felt hollow. It was like the woods swallowed the memory whole, leaving only the fear that still clings to summer nights. Sometimes when the air is thick and the world goes silent, I swear I hear that tapping again. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Story the end. That summer was supposed to be just another ordinary stretch of long, humid nights in the middle of Missouri. I was 23, freshly out of my junior year at university, and spending the summer back home in a small town that barely made a blip on the map. My friends and I didn't have much to do besides drive around, hang out by the river, or try to find some cool spot to escape the suffocating heat. Everyone talked about going to the old Miller farm out past the county line, an abandoned property that was said to be haunted, but no one really believed those stories. It was mostly just a dare, a place to prove you weren't scared. My best friend Luke and I decided one Friday night to head out there with a couple of others, Sarah and Matt. We were all around the same age, just looking for something to break the boring cycle of our summers. We piled into Luke's truck around 9 p.m., the sun just setting behind the cornfields, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was thick and heavy with humidity. Even the slightest breeze felt sticky on your skin. The drive to the Miller farm was about 20 minutes down a winding back road, past the last houses and into open fields. The farm itself was an old 2-story house, peeling white paint, boarded-up windows, and a barn that looked like it might collapse any minute. The place had been empty for years. Rumors said the family had disappeared, and no one had lived there since. We parked the truck near the barn and grabbed some flashlights and beers, daring each other to explore the property. Sarah was nervous, but gamely followed us. The air smelled of dry earth and wild grass. Crickets chirped nonstop, and somewhere nearby a whippoorwill called out. At first, everything was just typical small-town exploring. We checked out the inside of the barn, finding old rusty tools and broken furniture covered in dust and spiderwebs. Luke joked about ghosts, making us laugh to hide our own nervousness. But as we wandered closer to the house, the atmosphere changed. The front door was ajar, hanging on one hinge, creaking softly in the night breeze. Luke nudged it open further, and we stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under our feet. The smell inside was stale, a mix of mold and decay. The moonlight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting eerie shadows. We moved room to room, our flashlights bouncing off faded wallpaper and broken glass. On the kitchen table, we found a dusty old photo album. Luke flipped it open, and we stared at black and white pictures of a family, a mother, father, and 2 kids, smiling in front of the house. The last photo was torn, the edges jagged. That's when we heard it, a soft whispering coming from upstairs. At first, we thought it was the wind, but the voices were too clear, too deliberate. They sounded like someone calling a name. Matt swore he heard his own name whispered. Nerves tightened in the group, but curiosity pushed us forward. We climbed the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. Upstairs, the hallway was lined with peeling wallpaper and broken doors. The whispering grew louder, echoing around us. Suddenly, a door slammed shut at the far end of the hallway. Sarah screamed. We all froze. Luke shone his flashlight toward the door, but it didn't move again. A heavy silence fell. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaky. We hurried downstairs, but just as we reached the bottom, the front door slammed shut behind us. We rushed to open it, but it was stuck fast. Luke pushed with all his might, finally forcing it open. We spilled outside, gasping for breath. As we scrambled back toward the truck, we heard footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate, crunching on gravel. We didn't dare look back until we were safely inside the truck. But the feeling that something was following us didn't leave. That night, none of us slept well. Strange noises echoed outside our homes. Footsteps pacing, whispers barely audible through the walls. Sarah claimed she saw shadowy figures standing outside her bedroom window. Over the next week, we tried to shrug it off, but the unease lingered. Then, Matt disappeared. No note, no calls, just gone. The police found no signs of foul play, but Matt's room was left in disarray as if he'd fled in a hurry. We never went back to the Miller farm. The stories about the place didn't seem so silly anymore. And sometimes on summer nights when the wind is still and the darkness deep, I swear I hear those whispers calling my name. Story, the end. That summer night was hotter than usual, the kind of heat that sits heavy on your skin and doesn't let up, even after the sun slips behind the trees. I was 17, living in a quiet town in rural Indiana, and like most kids my age, I didn't have much to do but hang out with friends and find ways to pass the time until school started again. The nights were when we felt free, riding bikes down empty streets, sitting on porches, and telling stories that got a little darker as the hours crept by. On this particular evening, my friends Alex and Megan and I decided to bike out to the edge of town near the old abandoned mill. The mill had been shut down for years, its rusted machinery and broken windows a constant source of creepy fascination for local kids. Nobody ever went in there anymore, not since some teenagers had gotten caught trespassing a few summers back, but the area around it was still our favorite hangout spot when the temperature dropped just enough to make being outside bearable. We left around 9, the sky still glowing faintly orange, and the air thick with humidity. Our bikes rattled over cracked pavement as we talked and laughed, trying to ignore the weight of the heat pressing down on us. When we reached the mill, the place looked even more rundown than usual. The metal siding peeled and bent in sharp angles, and the windows were dark and empty, like black holes in the side of the building. A faint breeze rustled through the nearby trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic and sharp. We parked our bikes near a pile of old wooden crates and sat down, the concrete cold beneath us even in the heat. Alex pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and we took turns, the smoke curling into the night air. Megan was quieter than usual, scanning the shadows beyond the mill with a wary eye. "It's too quiet here," she said softly, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but tried to shake off the unease. We were just being dumb kids, looking for a thrill. The mill had been abandoned for years, nothing more than a relic, right? After a while, we decided to explore a little. There was a narrow trail behind the mill that led into the woods, dense and tangled, but with a faint dirt path cutting through it. The three of us started down the trail, the beam of Alex's flashlight bobbing ahead. The trees closed in around us quickly, the night swallowing up the light and the sound of our footsteps. About 20 minutes in, the trail opened into a small clearing. Moonlight spilled down between the branches, illuminating a circle of stones arranged in a rough ring. We stopped, looking at it with growing unease. There were strange symbols scratched into the rocks, deep and jagged, like someone had been trying to carve something important or threatening. "I've never seen this before," Megan said, stepping closer to touch one of the stones. Her fingers trembled. Suddenly, from somewhere deeper in the woods, we heard a low, guttural growl. It was distant but unmistakable, a sound that didn't belong to any animal we knew. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and the three of us froze. "What was that?" Alex whispered. Before we could answer, the growl came again, closer this time, sharper and more menacing. We all turned toward the sound, shining the flashlight beams into the darkness. The woods seemed empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Something moved just beyond the edge of the light, a shadow slipping between the trees. "We should go," Megan said, her voice tight with fear. We turned back the way we came, but the trail seemed different now. The trees pressed in tighter, and the path was harder to see. The growling followed us, growing louder, and we realized that whatever it was coming after us. Panic set in. We broke into a run, branches whipping at our arms and faces, hearts pounding in our chests. The growl was right behind us now, and through the trees I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes, red and unblinking. We burst out of the woods near the edge of town, gasping for breath. The growling stopped, but the fear stayed with us long after we got home. That night, sleep didn't come easy, and though the summer stretched on, none of us ever went back to the mill or the woods again. Sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still hear that growl, low and hungry, coming from the trees. Story the end. That summer, everything felt like it was melting, like the world itself was slowing down under the thick, humid air of a small Midwestern town in July. I was 17 and restless. The kind of restless that only a long, endless summer can breed when you're stuck between the awkward years of high school and the open, unknown horizon of what comes next. My friends and I had always spent these nights outside, in the long twilight hours, chasing fireflies, jumping into the river to cool off, or just sitting on the creaky wooden dock by the lake, drinking cheap sodas and daring each other to swim out further. That year was no different. The four of us, me, my best friend Ben, his sister Amy, and our friend Mark, had made a ritual out of meeting at the lake every Friday night. It was a patch of calm and freedom, the kind of place where you could forget that school was looming, that summer would end, and the future would demand your attention. But one night in late July changed everything. We'd been hanging out by the water for hours, the sun finally dipping behind the trees and the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. The air smelled of wet grass and charcoal from a nearby campfire someone had left smoldering. The lake's surface was smooth, reflecting the stars as they started to peek out, twinkling faintly in the deepening blue. We had just finished telling ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last, when Ben suggested we explore the woods behind the campsite. "There's a spot back there I found last summer," he said, eyes gleaming with excitement. "An old abandoned cabin. Nobody goes there, but it's cool. We should check it out." Amy looked hesitant, and I could feel the unease creeping in. The woods around the lake were dense, dark pockets of shadows and unknown noises, the kind that always made your skin crawl just a little. But Ben was relentless. Mark shrugged, eager for the adventure, and I didn't want to be left out. So we grabbed our flashlights and headed in. The path was narrow and barely visible under the thick canopy. The sounds of the night creatures, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves felt amplified, and the air was cooler beneath the trees. Our flashlight beams flickered as we pushed through brambles and twisted roots. After about 20 minutes, we broke through the last thicket, and there it was, the cabin. A small, weathered structure, barely holding together, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. The wood was gray and cracked, the front door hanging crooked on its hinges. We stood in front of it, the silence pressing down. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under our shoes. Ben pushed the door open with a creak, and the stale smell of rot and mildew hit us immediately. Inside, the cabin was dark and cramped. The floorboards were warped, the furniture broken and decayed. Dust floated in the shafts of our flashlight beams. Amy shivered. "I don't like this," Mark laughed nervously. "It's just an old cabin." We explored cautiously, stepping over broken glass and rusted tools. Then, in the corner, Ben found something. A small, dusty book, bound in cracked leather. He opened it carefully, and the pages revealed strange symbols and handwriting, like a diary or journal. He started reading aloud. At first, it was about the family that lived here, the Millers who had vanished years ago without explanation. Then the tone shifted. The entries became frantic, describing nightmares, voices in the woods, and a feeling of being watched. Ben's voice trembled as he read the last line. "They come when the night is thick. They watch, they wait, and they take." Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness. Panic rose instantly. Mark fumbled with his light, cursing. Amy whispered, "Did you hear that?" From outside, a low growl rumbled. We froze. Another growl, closer. Then a scraping sound at the window. Something heavy slammed against the cabin's walls. We ran. Out into the night, crashing through underbrush, not looking back. Our hearts pounded in our chests as the sounds followed us. Growls, snaps, the thud of footsteps too heavy to be human. We burst out of the woods into the open by the lake, collapsing on the grass, gasping. The noises stopped. The silence returned. We never went back. But sometimes when the summer night is still and the wind carries strange whispers, I swear I hear those growls again, coming from the dark, and I wonder if something is still out there, waiting. Story, the end. The summer of 2018 had been unusually hot in central Pennsylvania. Nights stretched long and sticky, with humidity that felt like a wet blanket clinging to your skin. I was 24 at the time, home from college for the summer, working the night shift at a local gas station in a town called Millersville. Small, sleepy, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, but no one really talked about the odd things that happened just out of sight. That particular night was one of those nights where the heat made it impossible to sleep. My shift at the station had ended around midnight, but instead of heading straight home, I decided to meet up with my two best friends, Jake and Megan. We'd been friends since high school, and although we'd all gone our separate ways for college, summer always brought us back together. Jake was the adventurous type, always looking for something thrilling to break the monotony, while Megan was the skeptic, grounding us when our ideas got too wild. Jake called me earlier that evening, telling me about a spot he'd discovered just outside of town, a place called Pine Hollow. It was an abandoned stretch of woods near an old logging road, rumored among locals to be haunted. The kind of place that kids dared each other to visit, but no one really went near after dark. Jake was itching for a late-night adventure, and I was curious enough, if a bit nervous, to say yes. I met them outside a rundown diner at about 12:30 a.m. The streets were empty, the only sound the hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of a breeze moving through the trees. We piled into Jake's beat-up Chevy Silverado and took off toward Pine Hollow, the windows down to let in the thick summer air. The drive was short but tense. As we left the main roads behind, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the headlights barely cut through the dense tree canopy. The trees themselves seemed to loom closer together here, thick trunks covered in moss and vines. Jake's truck bumped over ruts and potholes as he navigated the rough logging road deeper into the woods. When we finally stopped, we were at a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the moonlight filtering weakly through the branches. The air was cooler here, but still heavy with the scent of pine and earth. We grabbed some flashlights and stepped out, the beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating fallen branches, moss-covered rocks, and a narrow path winding further into the woods. We started walking, the only sounds our footsteps crunching on the forest floor and the distant chorus of nocturnal insects. The deeper we went, the more the woods seemed to close in around us. It wasn't just the darkness. It was an almost physical pressure, like the forest was holding its breath. Jake led the way, grinning like a kid about to discover a secret. Megan followed close behind, glancing nervously over her shoulder, while I kept my eyes fixed ahead, trying to shake the feeling that we were being watched. After about 15 minutes, we reached a small clearing where an old, decaying cabin stood, half swallowed by the forest. The wood was rotted and blackened, windows broken or boarded up, and the door hung loosely on one hinge. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Jake was the first to approach. He pushed the door open with a groan, and the smell of damp wood and mold hit us. Inside, moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, revealing an interior littered with debris, rusted tools, broken furniture, and faded newspapers from decades ago. We stepped inside cautiously, our flashlights illuminating spider webs and the remains of what might have once been a hearth. Megan shivered and muttered something about how this place gave her the creeps. Jake, however, seemed fascinated. He moved to the back of the cabin, shining his light on the floorboards, which creaked underfoot. Suddenly he stopped and pointed. "Look at this," he said, kneeling beside a section of the floor that was slightly raised. "It looks like a trapdoor." We crowded around as Jake carefully pried at the edges with a stick. After a few tense moments, the wood gave way, revealing a dark hole beneath. The air rising from it was cool and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent. "I don't like this," Megan said quietly. "Maybe we should just leave." But Jake was already reaching into his backpack for a rope. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? Let's see what's down there." Reluctantly, we tied one end of the rope to a sturdy post and lowered it into the hole. It disappeared into the darkness, the beam of light barely penetrating beyond the opening. Jake volunteered to go first, slipping down the rope into the narrow shaft. We waited, hearts pounding in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, he called up, "It's a small cellar. I think there's something here." Megan and I exchanged uneasy glances. We were about to protest when Jake shouted, "Guys, you've got to see this." We shone our flashlights down the hole and helped pull Jake back up. In his hands was an old rusted metal box covered in dirt and cobwebs. It looked like a strong box or a safe, but the lock was broken. Jake forced it open with the crowbar he'd brought, and inside we found a collection of yellowed papers and photographs, all neatly bundled. The photos showed a family, a man, a woman, and a small boy, standing in front of the cabin. Their faces were worn and somber, but something about their eyes unsettled me. They seemed to look right through the camera, as if they knew we were coming. We spent the next hour going through the papers. They were mostly letters, some diary entries. The man, named Samuel, wrote about his life living in Pine Hollow during the 1940s. The entries became darker over time, filled with fear and paranoia. He mentioned strange noises at night, shadows moving just beyond the edge of the trees, and a feeling that something was watching his family. One passage stood out. "The woods whisper now. I hear them calling my name. They say to come into the darkness, to join them forever." I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if the forest is alive with something beyond our understanding. As I read this aloud, a sudden rustling in the bushes behind us made us jump. Our flashlights darted around, but there was nothing there. Just the sound of leaves stirred by the night breeze. We decided it was time to head back, the weight of the night pressing down on us. As we walked toward the truck, the woods grew unnervingly silent again. The usual nocturnal chorus was gone. That's when I saw it. A pale face, just at the edge of the tree line watching us. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The face was contorted into a grotesque smile that stretched impossibly wide. I froze, unable to breathe. Megan saw it too and grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Jake, ever the brave one, shone his flashlight directly at the face. It vanished. The silence returned, heavier than before. We didn't speak on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we reached the diner to drop Megan off, she looked at me and whispered, "We shouldn't have gone there." For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, in the dark, I'd hear whispers just beyond my window, faint and unintelligible. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my backyard, slow and deliberate. I looked out the window, but saw nothing. I haven't been back to Pine Hollow since that night, and I don't plan to. Some places aren't meant for the living to explore. Story the end. That summer night back in 2007 started out like countless others in my hometown of rural Pennsylvania. Warm, humid, the kind of night where the cicadas buzz so loud you swear the earth itself is humming. I was 21, freshly graduated from college, and desperate to shed the weight of my mundane job at the local hardware store. My closest friends, Mark, Jenna, and Kyle, had planned a small getaway to the old Whitaker property, a place on the outskirts of town known for its abandoned farmhouse and sprawling woods. The place had a reputation whispered among locals, but we were young and skeptical, dismissing the stories as campfire nonsense. That night, though, we would come to realize that some tales hold more truth than fiction. We piled into Mark's rusty pickup around 8 p.m., the windows down, the summer air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and something faintly metallic like old machinery left to rust. The dirt road leading to the Whitaker farm was bumpy, lined with towering oaks and maples that seemed to lean in close, their shadows stretching and twisting as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The old farmstead appeared suddenly through the trees, a dilapidated silhouette against the fading light. The house was a crumbling two-story with shattered windows and peeling paint, the porch sagging as if weighed down by unseen forces. An ancient barn leaned precariously nearby, its wooden boards weathered to a silvery gray. We unloaded our gear, 2 tents, sleeping bags, flashlights, a cooler filled with beer, and set about making camp near the edge of the tree line, just far enough to feel the oppressive silence of the woods pressing in on us. The only sounds were the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. As darkness deepened, Jenna sparked a small fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on our faces. We drank, laughed, and swapped stories, our voices breaking the stillness with ease. But as the hours wore on, the joviality faded into a tense quiet. The woods seemed to grow colder, and the air thickened with an unplaceable dread. At around midnight, Mark suggested we take a walk down to the creek that ran behind the property. The moon hung low and full, bathing the world in a pale, ghostly glow. We followed a narrow trail, the ground soft beneath our feet, the trees arching overhead like cathedral arches. Near the water, the night was still save for the gentle lapping of the creek against mossy stones. But then Jenna stopped, her breath catching. She pointed toward the opposite bank, where a figure stood just beyond the tree line. It was tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered clothing that seemed to ripple despite the stillness of the night. The figure didn't move, only watched. Its eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the moonlight with a cold, unnatural brightness. Suddenly, the figure vanished. We blinked, and it was gone. Yet the sense of being watched persisted, prickling our skin with icy fingers. We hurried back to camp, the shadows around us stretching longer, darker. That's when the noises began. A low whispering, so faint we first thought it was the wind. But the whispers grew louder, murmuring unintelligible words, circling us like a living thing. Our flashlights flickered and died. The fire sputtered out, panic settled in. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching dry leaves all around us, but no figure appeared. Mark grabbed Jenna and Kyle, urging them toward the tents. I stayed frozen, staring into the darkness where the whispers swirled like smoke. A voice, hoarse and chilling, cut through the night. Leave. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, stumbling through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The whispers followed, an endless cacophony pressing in from every side. When we burst back into the clearing, the old pickup was there, headlights flickering on as Mark fumbled with the keys. We jumped in, doors slamming, hearts pounding as we sped down the dirt road, away from the haunted farm and the things lurking within its shadows. Even now, years later, I can't forget the cold gaze of that figure by the creek, the oppressive weight of the whispers, or the terror of being hunted by something unseen in the night. Story, the end. That summer night was supposed to be just another chance to escape the boredom of our small town, a place where the biggest excitement was the annual county fair and the occasional Friday night high school football game. I was 22 at the time, home for the summer from college, and me and my two friends, Alex and Casey, had been itching for something different, something that didn't involve the usual routines and predictable faces. We decided to head out to the old Hollow Creek area, a stretch of woods and fields a little over an hour from town that was rumored to be off limits but rarely patrolled. The perfect place to camp, drink, and feel like we owned the night. We packed up a cooler, tents, flashlights, and whatever beer we could carry, setting off just after sunset. The drive itself was uneventful, a dusty two-lane highway winding through rolling hills and farms. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the fields, and by the time we turned onto the dirt road leading to the creek, the sky was a dark canvas sprinkled with stars. We parked near a clearing that looked out onto the creek, a wide ribbon of water that glimmered faintly under the moonlight. The air was thick with humidity, and the chorus of frogs and crickets filled the night with a kind of wild symphony. We set up our tents quickly, lit a small fire, and settled in. As the fire crackled, we talked about everything and nothing, college plans, relationships, the small worries that seemed huge in those moments. The night felt endless, free. But sometime after midnight, the sounds around us changed. The frogs and crickets fell silent. The wind stopped. The woods grew still. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, makes your skin crawl. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Not close, but coming from the trees lining the creek. Slow, deliberate, crunching on dry leaves and twigs. We froze, listening. Alex grabbed a flashlight, shining it toward the sound, but it was swallowed by the darkness before the beam could reach. Casey whispered, "Who's out there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Then came a low, guttural growl, unlike any animal we knew. We grabbed our gear and started moving toward the truck, every nerve on edge. The night air seemed to thicken, shadows shifting just beyond the firelight. As we reached the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged from the trees. Tall, hunched, its eyes glowing faintly red in the flashlight beam. We bolted, running toward the truck as the creature let out a piercing scream that echoed through the woods. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away, headlights cutting through the dark as the figure stood motionless in the clearing. For days afterward, none of us could sleep. We all swore we saw shadowy shapes lurking near our homes, felt eyes watching us from the dark. That summer night marked the end of our innocence, the moment we realized some places hold secrets better left alone. And every warm summer night since, I still hear those footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer from the dark. Story, the end.